everybody, and welcome back to the channel. My name's Amanda N, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Jack the Ripper. So this is unscripted, but I have a few points I want to make. I've studied this topic somewhat at length, and my dog is in the room, so if you hear any jingling, you know it's her. But anyway, we're going to start from the beginning, talk a little bit about the context of Jack the Ripper, and why there's a lot more to the story than you may know. So when you hear the words Jack the Ripper, I'm sure that you picture a creepy guy in a top hat in an alleyway who absolutely butchers women and then runs off into the night and has a bunch of victims. That's what we know to be Jack the Ripper. That's what most people know to be Jack the Ripper. However, where the more to the story comes in here is that many people assume Whitechapel in East End London was just this crime-infested place. To some extent, that's true. There were far more alcohol-related and gang-related crimes going on, but at the same time, the lawlessness from it being a poor area is exaggerated greatly. A lot of that is because of tabloids. If it bleeds, it leads, and of course sex sells. So with those two stereotypes in mind, of course the brutal murders of sex workers, or at the time called prostitutes, a lot of these sex workers being murdered, it was going to sell, of course. And so the character, I guess I should say, kind of a little bit of mix of both, Jack the Ripper was created. So I stumble over my words there every time. The reason why, he was a character created by the tabloids to some extent, but the reason why I'm so inclined to say caricature is because he was also that. There was a lot of xenophobia going on, especially around the Jewish community. Jews were depicted in these classically offensive ways with hooked noses and frizzy hair and very classic villain-looking ways. I'm of Jewish heritage, and so seeing the very offensive, stereotyped caricature of a Jewish person, yeah, it's bothersome. And that was what Jack the Ripper was seen as. In one paper that I've read about it, the paper that sort of inspired this, Murder, Media, and Mythology, that paper describes that it's actually said to some extent that the police did protect the Jewish community because they knew that if they said a Jew did this or a Jewish-looking person did this, then the Jewish community, it would be a massive riot and issues, and they would be targeted and have a very hard time. Not that that didn't happen later, but you get the idea. So instead, witness testimonies that said, oh, they were Jewish looking in appearance. Instead, in the papers, those were published to say they were foreign looking in appearance. However, a lot of this xenophobia, a lot of this idea that these immigrants were lesser, did make the community as a whole look lawless and criminal, even though that wasn't necessarily the case. With working class and with lower class families, it's not as if they're lawless people. It wasn't until the late 1880s that, according to this paper and books that were used to source this paper, from that point on, it was no longer, quote, fashionable to blame the living conditions of the East End on vice, immorality, or the character deficits of its residents. New appreciation was given to the lack of opportunities provided to those living in the slums, end quote. So, you think of Ebenezer Scrooge going, oh, well, are there no workhouses? That's kind of where my mind goes when I'm thinking of this. There really was no other option other than to live in this really horrible, destitute, this poverty for a lot of these people. And it was seen as complete and utter chaos and poverty to some extent. Like I said, there is a truth in that, and police really couldn't solve crimes without having any kind of DNA evidence, without having any kind of ironclad, witness proof. But this Jack the Ripper mentality was born out of that. Whereas we're not even 100% sure that these were all definitely committed by the same person. It could be that there was one serial killer at the time who killed maybe these 5 women, maybe several of these women, maybe just some of the 11 women. It could be. But Jack the Ripper himself was created to sell papers by the tabloids. So while, yes, obviously there was someone responsible for these murders, I mean, somebody did kill these women, we don't know that they're connected. We don't know if they're from Whitechapel. We don't know that it's one extremely depraved human being. We don't know, and we may never know. There's some reported evidence that it could have been this Polish immigrant. That's the latest DNA finding, but unfortunately that's through mitochondrial DNA, not nuclear DNA. One is more reliable than the other. That's a whole thing in and of itself. There's been a lot of supposed solves for Jack the Ripper over the years. But in a way, Jack the Ripper was the embodiment of the pure Englishman's idea of Whitechapel being this depraved area. And the tabloids jumped on that. According to the paper, I'm going to read just another little section of it. The cultivation of the legend of the Whitechapel murderer was due to reformers using the murders as evidence for the need for reform. The murders were portrayed as an inevitable consequence of the state of the squalid conditions of the East End. By keeping the Whitechapel murders, and by implication the slum problems, central to discussion, it paved the way for reform. The Whitechapel murders had done more for social reformers, both socialist and conservative, to convince authorities to invest in improvements to the East End than unabated pressure through more orthodox methods of policy, public pressure, and acts such as the Poor Law had achieved in the previous 50 years. The Whitechapel murders coincided with the advent of sensationalist journalism, which mythologized the conditions in Whitechapel. The mythologizing of these conditions led directly to the mythologizing of the murders. This evolution from cold-blooded killer to social reformer is summed up by Warwick and Willis, who writes that, quote, Jack the murderer becomes Jack the missionary, murder allowed for social reform, end quote. So, in a way, Jack the Ripper was a good thing in that it allowed for people to realize, oh man, we have to change Whitechapel. This area needs help. But at the same time, in a way, the sensationalist reporting also allowed for that. And while sensationalist reporting isn't a good thing, if it allowed for social reform, I suppose that could be a good outcome. But all in all, Jack the Ripper was an amalgamation of the mythology and the prejudice of both East End and West End in London. I think that's a very good summary for it. I really, really recommend you check out the paper Murder, Media, and Mythology from Warwick. It's really interesting, and while Jack the Ripper to some extent did exist, there was a murderer in Whitechapel. Whether or not they lived there, we don't know, but there was a murderer who committed crimes in Whitechapel. But for all we know, it could have been one of these Englishmen that was having an affair with a sex worker and then went and did this. We have absolutely no clue what the case may have been, but the idea that xenophobia, prejudice, sensationalism, all of that plays into it is so rarely told when we look at the story of Jack the Ripper. So I just wanted to go off on a little tangent about that today. I hope you enjoyed that. I think it's interesting that Jack the Ripper may not have even existed. He may have just been a character created. I always think that's fascinating when the idea of something, a social concept, kind of becomes a character. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Let me know if you had any idea about this side of Jack the Ripper, or if you just thought he was a serial killer doctor wandering around in London 200 years ago. Thank you again for joining me today, guys. Let me know in those comments down below what you'd like to see next, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.